There is much spoken about spiritual awakening, yet few are prepared for what it truly asks of the soul. It is not a light switch, nor a blissful ascent. It begins with a quiet rupture. One day, the familiar no longer feels alive. The roles you play start to feel like a costume. The motivations that once pushed you forward fall silent. Life still moves around you, but something essential within you begins to unthread itself from the story you've been telling. There are no dramatic signs at first, only a subtle erosion of meaning. You wake, you work, you engage, and yet, beneath it all, a restless silence grows, a deep unease that cannot be reasoned with. This is not depression, it is the soul preparing to awaken, and in Jung's eyes, this marks the first stirring of individuation, the moment when the unconscious begins its long descent into the known self. The outer world remains unchanged, but your inner landscape begins to crack. A strange intuition arises. It whispers that there is something more, something real, but it lives in a territory you have not yet learned how to enter. And so the search begins, not as a rebellion against life, but as a pull towards something profoundly true. Jung observed that awakening often begins with what he called the collapse of false peace. The persona, the social mask designed to please and perform, starts to disintegrate. The lines you once repeated no longer make sense because the character has outlived its purpose. You are no longer at home in your identity. A fracture opens between who you've become and who, in some unspoken way, you sense you were always meant to be. This is the beginning. It is not clear. It is not peace. It is the tremble before the truth. A stirring of the authentic self rising through the cracks of the mask. And if you ignore it, it will keep unraveling what is false until you have no choice but to remember what is real. Once the old self begins to dissolve and the soul stirs from its slumber, a profound restlessness takes hold. It is not merely curiosity, it is hunger. A quiet but urgent movement begins inside you, compelling you to search beyond the surface of life. You begin gathering fragments of insight, like sacred breadcrumbs scattered by those who walk the path before you. Books fall into your hands as if guided. Teachings, symbols, and stories arrive with uncanny timing. A word, a dream, a line of poetry can strike the heart with such force that something ancient within you awakens. This is the second stage of spiritual awakening, the sacred search. You turn towards spiritual traditions, mystic philosophies, and psychological maps, with the hope of naming the ineffable thing rising inside you. You meditate, you pray, you learn about archetypes, chakras, energy, synchronicity. Every idea feels like a key, every ritual a doorway. It is a time of exploration, of spiritual thirst. And yet, it is also where the first illusion quietly enters. The ego, no longer in control but still grasping for certainty, can hijack the search and turn it into accumulation. Instead of integrating, you begin collecting. More content, more methods, more tools. The mind becomes saturated, while the soul remains untouched. This is the danger of spiritual overload, a trance of consumption masquerading as transformation. Jung warned that true individuation is not found in adopting yet another belief system, but in discerning what genuinely resonates with your own inner knowing. The search must become a mirror, not a mask. Slowly, you learn to stop chasing the next teaching and instead listen for what pierces through the noise. You begin to notice which practices return you to your presence, which truths settle not in your intellect but in your body, your breath, your being. And when this balance is found, the fever of seeking begins to cool. Silence returns, but not as emptiness, as an invitation. In that stillness, the self begins to emerge, not as an idea, but as a flicker of something real. Something that has waited patiently beneath every book and mantra, whispering all along, "I am already here." After the long, often frantic search, something begins to shift, but not in the way you expected. It does not arrive with fireworks or clarity, but with a quiet presence that feels oddly familiar. A dream emerges and lingers longer than usual, leaving behind a feeling rather than an answer. A sensation passes through your body like a current of recognition. A moment of silence becomes so full that it almost speaks. This is the beginning of illumination, the third stage of awakening, and it does not announce itself. It simply appears, like a lamp quietly lit in the dark. You do not summon this experience. It comes uninvited but not unwelcome. Something within you begins to notice the signals. A recurring image, a symbol that appears in different places, a message that arrives at the perfect time, and though no one else may understand, you feel its meaning. These moments are not born from thought, but from direct contact with the self. Carl Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the silent center around which everything else revolves. It is not the ego's voice, but a deeper presence that speaks in the language of dreams, art, sensation, and insight. At this stage, you are still unsure. The questions remain, but something within you has shifted. You no longer feel entirely lost. There is a new orientation forming, a quiet coherence beneath the confusion. You begin to trust, not what the world says, but what you feel in your bones. This is not imagination, it is intuition rising from the unconscious. The self has begun to move. These experiences are sacred not because they answer everything, but because they touch something eternal inside you. They leave a trace, a soft imprint that cannot be unseen. The ego may resist or dismiss it, but your soul recognizes what is real. The path ahead is still unclear, but now you walk with a subtle inner light. The difference is not that you know more, it is that you have felt something true, and once touched by that truth, you cannot go back. This is illumination, a brief but powerful meeting with the deeper layers of your being. And though the experience may pass, the memory of it stays, and that, alone, is enough to keep walking. The fourth stage is resistance. Not a flaw in the process, but an inevitable threshold. The ego, unsettled by the soul's subtle tremors and the gentle stirrings of the self, begins to panic. It clings to the old familiar scripts, the routines, roles, and identities that once made you feel secure. But now, those very comforts feel constrictive, like garments that no longer fit. And yet, out of instinct or fear, you try to squeeze yourself back into them. This is the silent war within. The unconscious rises, asking for change, and the ego retreats, desperate to preserve what once was. Doubt enters like a fog. Was that insight real? Did I imagine the signs? The mind starts building defenses, not from clarity, but from fear. Jung understood this psychic resistance as the ego's natural reflex. It is not trying to destroy your growth. It is trying to survive. For parts of you, the cost of becoming new feels like the death of the known. And so begins the inner tug-of-war. One part longs to leap into what is calling, the other fears being swallowed by uncertainty. Dreams may lose their clarity, intuition once vivid becomes faint, what once felt luminous now flickers. The soul still whispers, but the ego drowns it out with noise. Exhaustion creeps in, not from doing too much, but from holding too tightly. You feel split, living between two versions of yourself, the one dissolving and the one emerging. But something important happens here. Resistance, over time, begins to ache. Its walls start to weigh more than the fear of what lies beyond them. And then comes the quiet surrender. Not a dramatic gesture, but a soft release. The ego lowers its weapons, not in defeat, but in recognition that it can no longer maintain the illusion of control. This moment is sacred, because what you may call regression or weakness is actually transition. Resistance is not failure. It is the cry of a part of you that knows it is being left behind. Be gentle here. Jung would remind us, transformation begins the moment we bring awareness to what we once pushed away. You do not need to overpower resistance. You only need to listen to it. For what it truly fears is not the unknown, it is being seen. And that is where healing begins. The fifth stage of spiritual awakening is the descent into the abyss, a profound encounter with the shadow. It does not arrive gently or with warning. It rises abruptly from the depths of the unconscious, demanding to be seen. After the ego's resistance begins to fracture, the darker layers of the psyche come forward. But they do not come bearing light. They carry what has long been hidden. The rage you suppressed to keep the peace, the fear you disguised as logic, the shame buried beneath perfectionism, the guilt masked by overcompensation. All of it returns, not to punish you, but to be reclaimed. Jung understood the shadow as the sum of all that the ego rejects. It is not evil, it is unloved. And until it is brought to consciousness, it governs from the dark. The moment of awakening does not always feel like light pouring in. Sometimes it is the slow realization that your carefully constructed identity is incomplete. You find yourself saying things that don't match your story, reacting in ways that reveal wounds still unhealed. You feel disoriented, as if the version of you that once made sense no longer holds. This is not madness. This is a revelation. It is the soul showing you what still needs to be honored. There is no roadmap through the abyss, only the courage to remain present while everything within you is being rearranged. Jung reminded us that the shadow is not merely darkness. It holds untapped gold, your authenticity, your power, your creative fire. But to retrieve it, you must face the discomfort of what you once disowned. This stage asks you to let go of illusion and meet yourself in full. Not to conquer the shadow, but to embrace it. When you do, something begins to shift. Pain does not vanish, but it transforms. It no longer paralyzes, it begins to ground. And in that grounding, a quiet strength emerges. You realize that the path to integration does not avoid the darkness. It walks through it, holding a light born not from perfection, but from presence. The abyss is not the end. It is the beginning of becoming whole. The sixth stage of awakening is the death of the old self, a quiet yet devastating collapse of the identity you once believed to be you. It is not a metaphorical ending, it is a psychic dismantling. The scaffolding of your former life, your roles, titles, ambitions, and inherited dreams begins to crack and fall away. What once felt solid now feels foreign. You watch your own life from the inside as if the script is still playing, but the actor has gone silent. This unraveling comes gradually at first, then all at once. And though you may have prayed for transformation, nothing prepares you for the hollow stillness that follows. The world around you may appear unchanged. The routines, the faces, the obligations remain. But internally the fire has dimmed. Your motivations vanish. The color drains from old desires. Words that once defined you now feel lifeless on your tongue. You try to name what you are becoming, but language fails. All you are left with is an unbearable silence. This is not dysfunction, it is initiation. The loss is not a sign of error, but of emergence. As Jung taught, individuation requires the death of the ego's illusion of control so that the self may rise from the fragments. Here, you are alone, not abandoned, but necessarily solitary. No one can walk this passage for you. Advice falls flat. Maps no longer apply. What you are undergoing is sacred mourning. You are grieving the self that was never fully you. The self is shaped by fear, expectation, and survival. In this dark chrysalis, the soul begins its hidden work. It decomposes what no longer serves and rearranges your inner structure. There is no shortcut, no acceleration. To rush is to deny, to wait is to witness. In this void, you begin to hear what was always speaking beneath the noise. The soul requires stillness to be heard, and just when the silence feels too heavy to bear, a flicker of new life arises, soft, almost imperceptible, but real, a breath, a knowing. The rebirth begins, not in fanfare, but in the quiet return of presence. This is not the end of you. It is the end of who you are not. And in that space, the authentic self begins to grow. The seventh stage of spiritual awakening is the quiet emergence of the authentic self. It does not arrive with fanfare or certainty, but through small, faithful acts of alignment. A more honest decision here, a refusal to self-betray there. The atmosphere within you subtly changes. You are no longer shaped by the need to please or perform. Instead, you begin listening inwardly, and what arises is not a role, not a perfected version of who you used to be, but something raw and real. This is not the return of the old self, nor is it a newly crafted persona. It is the slow birth of presence, truth, unclothed. You find yourself speaking more sincerely, even when your voice trembles. You stop over-explaining. You begin choosing not from fear or habit, but from a deeper coherence. The need to be understood is no longer as urgent. The pull to conform weakens. The ego, once the ruler of your choices, now begins to take its rightful place as servant. It does not vanish, but it bows to something greater, the self. Carl Jung spoke of the self as the totality of the psyche, a guiding wholeness that is not constructed, but discovered. Here, that discovery becomes tangible. You feel it in the way your reactions soften, in the way your impulses slow, in the calm that arrives when you finally let go of chasing approval. You are rebuilding, and this time, the foundation is not external validation, but internal truth. Emotional independence begins to take root, not as a disconnection from others, but as a deepening connection to yourself. You begin to understand that love is not performance, that worth is not conditional, and that truth is not something to earn, it simply is. And you begin to live from it. The shift is quiet but seismic. You do not need to announce it. The world around you begins to respond to your coherence. This is not the end of the journey. The authentic self is still forming, but it is no longer hiding. It is breathing, walking, and choosing. And that, in itself, is the beginning of freedom. Not the freedom to become someone else, but the freedom to return to who you have always been, underneath it all. The 8th stage of awakening is marked by the quiet and unmistakable language of synchronicity. Carl Jung described synchronicity as the meeting point between inner and outer realities, where two events, though unrelated by cause, are bound together through meaning. It is here that the world begins to mirror the soul, not with explanations but with symbols. You no longer chase signs with desperation. They arrive on their own, unannounced and precise. A phrase on a billboard, a song at just the right moment, a dream that echoes waking life. These are not accidents, they are invitations. What is most striking is not the appearance of these signs, but how deeply they resonate. They may appear insignificant to others, but to you they are profound, because they speak in a language only your inner world understands. Not as proof of certainty, but as whispers of alignment. They reflect not your desires, but your presence. A subtle confirmation that something inside you has shifted, and reality now moves in rhythm with it. You begin to listen differently, to watch not just events, but patterns, to sense the texture of time itself. Reality begins to feel less like a machine and more like a song. It breathes with you, moves with you. Your consciousness becomes a tuning fork, and the world hums in response. Jung saw this as a sign that the psyche and the cosmos were no longer strangers. The line between them thins. The unconscious no longer hides beneath the surface. It speaks through the world, through mirrors, through timing that feels sacred. This is not mysticism. It is psychological truth, clothed in metaphor. When you live with coherence, the world reflects coherence. When you walk with inner harmony, outer events begin to harmonize. These synchronicities do not solve your problems, they do not remove uncertainty, but they restore trust, not blind faith, but a deeper knowing, that even in chaos there is rhythm, that even in confusion there are signs, and that you are not separate from the world you walk through. You are a participant in its unfolding. And now, finally, it begins to speak your name. The 9th stage of awakening is the emergence of authentic expression, not as performance, but as an inevitable flowering of inner coherence. After crossing the abyss, enduring the symbolic death of the old self, and witnessing the synchronistic dialogue between the inner and outer world, something within you insists on truth, not intellectual truth, but soul truth. And it begins to shape the way you live, speak, and show up. Your voice changes, not because you rehearse it, but because it now rises from deeper ground. You say what you actually mean. You choose what you genuinely desire. You begin to speak from essence, not expectation. There is no need to convince or impress. You no longer edit your soul to fit the room. This kind of honesty may not always be welcomed. Some will resist the new vibration you bring. Relationships that once felt essential may drift. Roles you played may dissolve. Yet in this discomfort, a strange liberation emerges. You realize that what does not align was already straining to stay. The social mask does not shatter all at once. It fades in subtleties, in moments when you no longer laugh at what wounds you, in pauses where once you filled space to keep peace, in refusals to explain yourself, where silence now feels like power. This transformation does not demand perfection. You will slip into the old self. You will be tempted to betray your truth again. But now, when you do, the soul tightens. It sends signals, restlessness, static, a sense of exile within your own skin. You can't unknow what you now feel. The soul has tasted alignment, and it demands fidelity. As Jung taught, individuation is not imitation, but incarnation. Your unique essence, once buried beneath conditioning, now claims its voice. This is not about shouting louder. It is about standing still with integrity. You do not need everyone to agree. You only need to stop abandoning yourself. And when you do, the world rearranges itself accordingly. New relationships arrive. Work becomes aligned with meaning. Simplicity replaces complexity. And peace arises not from controlling others, but from embodying your truth. Authentic expression is not a performance. It is presence, and presence is the language of the self. It speaks not in volume, but in vibration, and once it begins to speak through you, there is no going back. The 10th stage of spiritual awakening marks a sacred return, not to a doctrine or idea, but to direct contact with the self, the silent center of the psyche that Carl Jung described as the totality of the conscious and unconscious. Here, the self is no longer a concept whispered through books or glimpsed in symbols. It is a living presence. You do not think about it, you feel it. You live from it. It becomes your inner axis, quietly anchoring you while the world around you continues its shifting tides. This state does not arrive with noise or drama. It comes like still water, clear and unmoved. You begin to notice that your decisions no longer arise from fear or urgency, but from a place of calm discernment. The self does not argue. It does not beg to be heard. It moves like a quiet compass, gently but firmly pointing you toward what is real. Its guidance is not loud, but it is unmistakable. Even when life outside feels chaotic, you remain rooted, not because the storm ceased, but because your identity is no longer held hostage by external events. The need to control fades, judgment softens, comparison loses its sting. There is no more inner war to win, there is only presence. A spacious listening, an intimate trust in your own inner rhythm. Jung taught that true individuation was the recentering of the psyche around the self, rather than the ego. It does not erase suffering, it transforms your relationship to it. Pain still visits, doubt still knocks, but they no longer define you. You observe them with compassion, not collapse. You respond rather than react. This inner clarity cannot be faked, nor can it be rushed. It is earned through surrender, through letting go of the masks and illusions that once structured your sense of worth. Now, your being is no longer contingent on validation. You move through the world with quiet wholeness, no longer seeking to prove, only to live in integrity with the truth that pulses in your bones. Direct contact with the self is not transcendence in the usual sense. It is the embodiment. It is the realization that you are not here to escape the human experience, but to inhabit it fully, with your soul in the lead. And when the self leads, life becomes less of a battle and more of a sacred unfolding. The 11th stage of awakening is the sacred recognition of co-creation, the dawning realization that the outer world is not a fixed, objective reality, but a living mirror that reflects the condition of your inner life. In Jung's view, the world you encounter is shaped in large part by the contents of your own psyche. The patterns of your perception, the lens of your beliefs, and the tone of your emotional energy do not merely color your experience. They influence what emerges in your path. Life stops being a sequence of unrelated events and begins to reveal an underlying order. Not a mechanical order, but a symbolic one. A dialogue between soul and circumstance. At this stage, you no longer live as a passive observer. You become an active participant in the unfolding of your reality. What once appeared as chaos begins to align, not with your desires alone, but with your essence. Your outer life starts to echo your inner alignment. This is not the magical thinking of control, nor is it a denial of hardship. It is a mature awareness that your inner state casts shadows and shapes upon the canvas of the world. A wound can become a teacher or a tyrant. A loss can shut a door or open the soul. You begin to choose the meaning you embody, and in doing so, reshape what meaning returns to you. Jung spoke of the individuation process as the movement toward wholeness, and part of that movement is this realization that you do not just walk through life, you shape the very road you travel. The blame dissolves. The narrative shifts. You stop saying this happened to me and begin to ask, what within me is speaking through this event? You no longer live in reaction, you live in response. This does not mean perfection, it means presence. You live from the center, not from the storm. You begin to see your relationships rearrange themselves, not through force, but through frequency. The cycles that once repeated begin to break, not because the world changed, but because you no longer energize them from the same place within. Co-creation is not controlled, it is attunement. When you align your inner truth with your outer steps, reality begins to resonate in harmony, and this is where awakening shifts from insight into embodied power. It becomes not just a personal journey, but a living contribution to the collective. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.